Okay, so my topic is deconstructing keto and paleo diets. And a very quick outline, we're going to define keto and paleo diets, talk a little bit about the differences in these diets, then we'll dig deeper into some of the claims of the keto and paleo movements. We will compare plant-based with low-carb diets, and then we will end up by talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly, where low-carb diets are concerned. So first, what is a ketogenic diet or a keto diet? It's really a very high-fat, low-carbohydrate eating plan that forces our body to shift from using glucose as the major fuel to using ketones. And the metabolic state, of course, is called ketosis. And the basic premise in the keto world is that ketones are actually the preferred fuel for the body. When we are in ketosis, we experience the ultimate in fat burning, and weight loss becomes effortless, and disease risk dramatically diminishes. So that's their basic premise. So what triggers ketosis? Well, of course, starvation, fasting, or severe food restriction. And there are some therapeutic applications for this, as you may be aware. The second is insufficient dietary carbohydrates, very high-fat, low-carb diets, and that will be the focus of the lecture here today. So ketones cannot, and I think this is a really important point, ketones cannot be used by all cells. As much as 50% of our basal energy needs and 70% of our brain's energy needs can be met by ketones. But however, to use ketones, cells have to have mitochondria, and they have to also have certain enzymes, and some cells don't have this. For example, red blood cells lack mitochondria. They can thrive only using glucose. And that's the same with liver cells. They lack a necessary enzyme called beta-ketoacyl-CoA transferase. And without that, they must use glucose. So if we look at keto macronutrients, what we're looking at is about 5% of calories from carbs, about 20%, and this ranges probably 10 to 25% of calories from protein, and about 75% on average from fat. We see a range of about 70 to 80, and this is actually the sort of popular keto weight loss diets. These are the most extreme of all low-carb diets. Now, a classic ketogenic diet for epilepsy is even more rigid. So you're looking at about 90% of calories from fat, about 2 to 4 from carbohydrate, and about 6 to 8 from protein. So what foods are permitted on a keto diet? Well, you can see at the base of the pyramid, we've got meat, poultry, fish, and then eggs and very high-fat, low-carb dairy products like cheese, fats and oils, green veggies, and then some non-starchy vegetables, nuts, seeds, and berries. And you can see at the bottom, of course, grains and legumes and other high carbohydrate foods like fluid milk are excluded, and of course sugar. And the sort of the theme of a keto diet is eat fat, eat meat, poultry, eggs, and fish. The fattier the better. Eat non-starchy vegetables. And here's a sample recipe. I just looked on paleo websites. This is what you've got. 3 pounds of beef and 6 cups of cheese. 2 cups of frozen pepper strips. That's the recipe. And so about an eighth of the recipe is almost 800 calories with 61 grams of fat, 30 grams saturated fat, 7 grams of carbohydrate, about 49 grams of protein, 205 milligrams of cholesterol, and a half a gram of fiber. This is really quite typical of keto recipes. So now let's flip over to the paleo diet. And what is a paleo diet? Well, it's really a pattern of eating that attempts to mimic the diet of our Paleolithic ancestors. The basic premise here is what humans ate in pre-agricultural times is the diet best suited to our genetic makeup. The shift from a hunting and gathering diet to an agricultural diet rich in grains and legumes gave rise to our obesity and chronic disease epidemics. And so here's what the paleo macronutrients look like. And just so you know, this is probably the least extreme of all the low-carb diets. It's about 20% of calories from carbohydrates, 30% protein, so it's much higher in protein, and about 50% fat. And so what foods are permitted? Well, you can see the base of the pyramid, the meats there, meat and eggs, and then fruits and vegetables, nuts and berries. And of course, excluded are grains, legumes, and dairy products. So the slogan here is, if a caveman couldn't eat it, neither should you. And here's a sample recipe, just so you can see the differences. You've got coconut oil, coconut milk, pork tenderloin, and then a bunch of vegetables. And half the recipe, about 643 calories, 37 grams of fat, 54 grams of protein, 24 grams of carbohydrate, 147 milligrams of cholesterol, and 8 grams of fiber. So certainly higher in fiber because it's higher in vegetables. So let's compare paleo and keto, and you can see similarities in blue, differences in pink. And similarities, they're both high in meat, poultry, fish, and eggs. They both include nuts and seeds. They include green vegetables. They exclude legumes, and they exclude grains. Now with dairy is actually completely excluded from paleo, but the keto diet is actually very high in some of the low-carb dairy products like cheese and butter. Other non-starchy vegetables are included in paleo and limited in keto. Starchy vegetables are limited in paleo and excluded in keto. Fruits are moderate in paleo and very much minimized in keto. And concentrated fats and oils are moderate in paleo, and they are extremely high in keto. So again, macronutrients for keto, just to remind you, versus paleo. So you can see the higher protein, higher carbohydrate in paleo. So let's look a little more at the carbohydrate restriction involved. So keto diets are less than 5% of calories from carbohydrates. Other low-carb diets, about 6 to 20%, with paleo being at the highest end of that range. So how many grams of carbohydrates is that on a 2,000-calorie diet? Well, it's about 25 grams in a keto diet and about 100 grams in a paleo diet. So, and this is really important because remember, we're looking at about 5% for keto of calories from carbohydrate and about 20 for paleo. Look at the amount of carbohydrates in plant foods. Fruits, starchy vegetables, grains, legumes, and even non-starchy vegetables range from a low of about 58% of calories to a high of about 92% of calories on average within each food group. So you can see how difficult it would be to include reasonable amounts of these foods on a low carbohydrate diet. The only exception really is nuts and seeds, which are of course higher in fat at about 12% carbohydrates within the plant kingdom. And then you can see 2% milk at about 37% of calories from carbohydrates, which of course is lactose. And then eggs and cheese about 3, and meat, poultry, fish, fats, and oils 0. So you can see why those are the predominant foods in a keto diet especially. Now, if we look at the typical amounts in foods, a lot of people think that in these kinds of diets, especially keto diets, you can eat unlimited amounts of non-starchy vegetables, and that's actually not true. Look at the amounts. Remember, 25 grams is your upper limit in a keto diet. Well, check this out. An avocado, 17 grams. Turnips, Brussels sprouts, green beans, you're looking at somewhere 10 to 12 grams. A lot of other veggies around the 6 to 9 per serving. And then some vegetables, of course, are much lower, especially the leafy greens. And so we can easily get to that 25 grams, not consuming that many starchy vegetables. Now, the trend in the keto world is towards counting total carbs, but there are some that use what we call net carbs, and especially people who are trying to do a more plant-based keto diet, they will use net carbs. And net carbs are very simply total carbohydrates minus fiber. So for example, an avocado, a medium-sized 200-gram avocado, 17 grams of carbohydrate, the fiber is 13.5 grams. So you would minus that and you would work with a much smaller carbohydrate number. So you would be allowed a little more of these carbohydrate foods. Now, just to give you an idea of the carbohydrate content of other foods, we see about 30 to 60 grams in about a cup of grains or a medium-sized potato. We see 30 grams in an apple. I can remember being at the gym and this lady saying to me, "I never realized how bad apples are for you." So it's just so, these diets have become so popular. A cup of blueberries, 21 grams. So they say they can eat them, but when you're limited to 25 grams a day, how much can you really eat? And so you can see at the bottom of the chart, things like butter and cheese and sour cream are very low in carbohydrates. So these are foundational foods. So which is more healthful, a keto diet or a paleo diet? Well, a keto diet, of course, most extreme of low-carb diets. It's mainly fat and meat. Plant foods are heavily restricted. Paleo is the least extreme of the low-carb diets. It allows more liberal intake of plant foods. So, of course, paleo is more healthful than keto because it's got higher levels of protective nutrients. So let's dig a little deeper into some of the keto claims. So these are common claims, and there are many, many more. I had to pick a few. But that it reduces epileptic seizures, it's best for weight loss, keto diets reverse diabetes, kill cancer, and increase longevity. So let's take a quick peek at these. Is there really any truth to these claims? Well, we actually have pretty convincing evidence for epilepsy. And so the research suggests that about 36 to 85% of patients with epilepsy experience more than 50% seizure reduction with ketogenic diets, and 10 to 15% of patients actually become seizure-free. It's most effective for those with refractory epilepsy that don't respond to medications, or those with epileptic syndromes like GLUT1 deficiency. And for those that aren't familiar with this, this is the protein that helps you to carry glucose into the brain. And if you've got a deficiency in that, what kind of energy are you using to feed the brain? So switching to an alternative fuel for the brain, it seems to reduce seizures and improve cognitive function in these people. So, however, the risks are greatly documented. Cardiovascular disease increase, malnutrition, stunted growth, bone disorders, constipation, dehydration, GI disturbances, metabolic acidosis, kidney stones, liver abnormalities, and blood disorders are all common in the children that use these kinds of diets. We have moderate evidence for weight loss. Short-term research, we have reports of weight loss in trials that are about 3 weeks to 4 months long. And we see favorable changes in body composition and markers of inflammation. And the other thing we see is very significant appetite suppressant. People don't feel very hungry when they're eating this way. The long-term research isn't quite as favorable. We have a meta-analysis from 2013, 13 randomized controlled trials that show slightly more weight loss, about 2 pounds on average over a year on a keto versus what they call a low-fat diet, which is a diet that's under 30% of calories from fat, so not really low in fat. And the folks on keto had lower triglycerides but a higher LDL, also higher HDL. There weren't any significant differences in blood pressure, fasting glucose, insulin, A1C, or C-reactive protein. However, weight loss was actually very similar on both diets over 2 years. So the advantage disappeared. I thought this was a really interesting study. It was a metabolic ward trial on 17 overweight men, and it compared a baseline diet of 50% carbohydrate with a keto diet that was 5% carbohydrate. And both diets resulted in similar body fat loss. The loss of fat-free mass or muscle mass was actually greater on the keto diet, which is really quite concerning because that's not what you will want to lose when you're losing weight. You want to retain your muscle mass. And I think it's really important to mention here that anything, of course we know anything that promotes an energy deficit will promote weight loss. Many effective weight loss strategies, however, are damaging to health. And I remember, I don't remember, I'm not that old, but I remember seeing these commercials for smoking, and this was really popular in the 1920s, where they were so many advertisements encouraging people to smoke to keep a slim figure. And of course we know that's kind of a ridiculous way of achieving a healthy body weight. It's not a good plan, nor are keto diets in my opinion. And the U.S. News Best Diet Rankings, the expert panel of 2018 found that out of 40 diets, in the best diets overall category, keto diet tied for last place, And in the best diets for healthy eating, keto diet ranked dead last. Why? Well, they said that it is because the diet's extremely high in total unsaturated fat and fatty animal products, and it has a very high potential for nutritional deficiencies, particularly fiber, potassium, folate, magnesium, and vitamin C. And it also has multiple adverse side effects. So we have limited or mixed evidence for diabetes and cancer. And for diabetes, short-term benefits we've seen in a number of studies: weight loss, improved glucose control, reduced A1C, lower triglycerides, and reduction in the need for medications. But the downside is keto diets do not reverse insulin resistance. If a person eating a low-carb diet is challenged with a load of carbohydrate, they tend to have very significant spikes in blood glucose because they remain so insulin resistant. And over the long term, although we don't have long-term studies using keto diets, we do have a number of long-term low-carb studies. And again, we see favorable short-term responses, less favorable long-term. We have a systematic review of over 12 weeks, and there were no differences in weight or A1C with longer-term treatment when we compared that to a low-fat diet, a low GI diet, or a usual care diet for that matter. However, there are some very significant red flags where ketogenic diets are concerned. They're associated with fatty liver, systemic glucose intolerance, insulin resistance, insufficient insulin secretion, reduced beta and alpha cell mass, dyslipidemia, and inflammation, although the studies on this are still quite preliminary. Now, for cancer, the theory is that sugar feeds cancer, and cancer cells can't use fat, so keto diets just basically kill your cancer cells, and you'll get better. And so what's the evidence? Well, actually, when I looked and did my PubMed searches, I was surprised at the number of small, very preliminary trials that have been published. And in 2011, a pilot study with 16 participants showed some improvement in quality of life and blood parameters, although there were no increases in longevity, no remissions in this study. 2012, 10 patients with advanced cancer found that keto diets inhibited insulin and was associated with and were associated with stable disease or partial remission. 2014, a study with 20 participants with recurrent blastoma and those on the keto diet. The keto diet seemed to improve effectiveness of a chemo drug, but there was no significant clinical activity of a keto diet alone. And then in 2015, there was a report of 32 case studies, and they found prolonged remission, although only one patient in this case used a keto diet alone. Then we've got 3 studies from 2016. The first, just 13 participants. They found that a novel cancer marker called TKTL1 was reduced on a keto diet, and then in 2016, another 6 participant study, 5 experienced tumor regression with early stage disease, but the one with lung cancer actually experienced progression. And then the latest study with 17 participants, 11 were evaluated. After 16 weeks on a keto diet, 4 participants were stable or improved. Only 3 continued the diet beyond 16 weeks. They couldn't manage it. 2 of them died, but 1 went into remission, but that was with a tumor resection. So that's about the extent of the evidence we have. We also have some contrary evidence. So in 2017, those with the BRAF V600E genetic mutation, it was found that those with that mutation had used ketones to actually, the cancers would grow faster. 2018, keto diet plus chemo slowed tumor growth better than the drug alone, but the keto diet alone actually accelerated the progression of cancer. And there was a brand new study, 2018, that found slow dividing brain cancer cells actually are fueled by fat. These cells are actually more invasive and resistant to chemo and radiation than the fast dividing cells. Now, in 2018, there was actually a comprehensive review looking at keto diets and cancer, and they basically said that the studies really failed to show that keto diets increase survival in advanced cancer patients. Not all tumors respond positively to keto diets, as I just mentioned. And keto diets may have potential if combined with chemo in early stages of the disease, so that was kind of the bottom line. Now, we also have a study looking at low-carb diets and cancer mortality that found it was a 2018 study that reported that people who ate the least carbohydrates had a 35% increased risk of dying of cancer compared to people eating the most carbohydrates. And cancer rates, we know, tend to be lowest in people eating more plant-based diets. We have contrary evidence for longevity, and we don't have any human studies assessing the impact of ketogenic diets on longevity. However, there are a lot of studies that have assessed the impact of carbohydrates on mortality. And I'm going to go quickly through this, but 2010, this is almost 130,000 participants. People eating low-carb animal-based diets had a 23% increase in mortality. Those eating low-carbohydrate plant-based diets had a 20% risk reduction in mortality. And then another study in 2014, a 33% increase on low-carbohydrate animal-based diets. Low-carb plant-based diets, there was no association. And another study in 2018, the lowest carbohydrate intakes were associated with a 32% increase in mortality. And then you're probably all familiar with this analysis of over 15,000 adults. And what they found in this study, this is looking at mortality and carbohydrate intake, that the highest increase in mortality was with the lowest carbohydrate intake, a 32% increase. And then the highest carbohydrate intake was also associated with an increased risk of 23%. But in this case, they found that high carbohydrate diets increased risk only when it was predominantly refined carbohydrates. The lowest risk was at about 50 to 55% of calories from carbohydrate. But if you look at this, the very lowest risk was also in the highest carbohydrate consumers, but that was associated with consuming carbohydrates from whole plant foods, not refined foods. And it was interesting, mortality actually increased 18% when the carbohydrate was exchanged for animal-derived fat or protein, and it was decreased 18% when the substitutions were plant-based. So the conclusion here, these data provide further evidence that animal-based low carbohydrates, which are more prevalent in North America and Europe, should be discouraged. So here's what we know about keto. The potential benefits, perhaps in epileptic seizure reduction, reduced energy intakes, weight loss, at least in the short term, lower blood sugar, and decreased triglycerides and increased HDL. The risks short term are constipation, weakness, fatigue, bad breath, muscle cramps, headaches, increased LDL cholesterol, impaired glucose tolerance, worsening kidney function, reduced athletic performance. And the risks long-term, increased all-cause mortality, increased exposure to persistent organic pollutants, metabolic disorders, birth defects, impaired artery function, kidney stones, bone loss, nutrient deficiencies, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So let's move on to paleo. So when people start eating paleo, they often lose weight. This is their claim, and I shortened it a little bit, but when people start eating paleo, they often lose weight, feel less hungry, and have fewer cravings for sugar. This way of eating can literally reverse diabetes, reduce your chances of getting cancer, reduce inflammation in your joints. It can help you avoid heart disease. So, when I first heard about paleo in about 2010, it was all the rage. I thought, this is a dangerous diet because we're talking about tripling our intake of meat, not a good plan. So, but for the sake of the argument, let's say that it actually is a good idea to eat like our ancestors. What would be the first question you would want to ask? Well, what did our ancestors actually eat? So pre-agricultural people, of course, ate wild plants, animals, fish, insects. The balance of these foods varied with time frame within the Paleolithic period, location, season, gathering and hunting skills, tools, and culture. Well, what didn't they eat? Well, they didn't eat anything from a box or bag. They didn't eat deep fried or fast foods. They didn't eat refined oil, sugar, or salt. They didn't consume the milk of other mammals. They didn't consume processed meats, and they didn't drink any alcohol. So the big question is, do new paleo diets equal true Paleolithic diets? And I went to look at nutritional anthropology to answer this question. And I found 2 reports that actually estimated very well the intakes of Paleolithic people. And one was from 1997 and the other was 2010, both from Melvin Connor and Boyd Eaton. And in the 2010 paper, they said early ancestral diets were overwhelmingly plant-based, with some insects and very small amounts of animal flesh. First 80% of the Paleo period, people were basically vegetarian. Reliance on meat increased later, the last 20% of the Paleo period, as hunting skills improved. However, much proof points to continued, significant, if not predominant, dependence on plant foods. And here is the DRIs for macronutrients. Here's the Paleolithic estimates from 97, and here's the Paleolithic estimates from 2010. And you can see calories were about 3,000, protein about 30%, carbohydrate around 35 to 65%, fat around 20 to 35, saturated fat around 6 to 12, cholesterol around the 500, the ratio of essential fatty acids around 2 to 1, fiber, well, originally 104 grams, and in the revised 2010, a broader range of 70 to 150. So anything jump out at you on this page? Fiber, it's unbelievable. You know, the average vegan gets, 40 or 50 grams, maybe 60 or 70 if they eat a lot. And I just thought, what the heck? There is no way anybody on a paleo diet that I know is eating 100 grams of fiber. So that was clue number 1. The second was, when you look at micronutrients, 500 or 600 milligrams of vitamin C, 1 to 2,000 of calcium without a single drop of cow's milk, and 7 to 10,000 were the estimates for potassium. I don't know any vegans that get that amount of potassium. Where do these nutrients come from? Plants. Right? Plants. And so I thought to myself right away, I wonder what is closer to a true Paleolithic diet, a paleo diet or a 100% plant-based diet. So I did the math. I analyzed 3 days worth of a paleo menu from one of the most popular paleo websites. Then I analyzed 3 days worth of recommended plant-based menu, which was 100% plant-based or vegan. And here's what we got. So, of course, I had to make sure all the diets were adjusted to be 3,000 calories, so it was a fair comparison. But the new paleo diet actually comes closer to a true paleo diet on protein, about 32% protein, plant-based about 15%. But the plant-based diet was closer on carbohydrate, fat, and saturated fat. The paleo diet had cholesterol, so I said it was closer, even though the plant-based is kind of closer in a way. And the essential fatty acids and fiber were closer on the plant-based diet. Most of the vitamins were closer on a plant-based diet, with the exception of vitamin A. Zinc was also closer on this new paleo diet, and everything else was closer on a plant-based diet. So the plant-based diet was actually way closer to the true Paleolithic diet than what people are calling paleo today. So if you look at the summary, the paleo diet is closer to a true Paleolithic diet for 4 nutrients: protein, cholesterol, zinc, and vitamin A. The plant-based diet was closer on 13 nutrients. And you can see the list here. So a Paleolithic diet does not equal a true Paleolithic diet. Why? Well, you think it was meat and plants. Why wouldn't it be the same? Well, today's paleo diet devotees, their focus is eating enough meat to get 30% of their calories from protein, as opposed to eating enough plants to get 100 grams of fiber or to get 500 milligrams of vitamin C. For some reason, they don't worry about those things. And the other thing that we need to know is wild foods don't equal farmed foods. Meat and vegetables consumed today were not available in Paleolithic times, and they bear very little resemblance to those eaten by pre-agricultural populations. Wild meat does not equal domestic meat. It is much higher in fat, about 30 to 60% of calories from fat versus 6 to 16 in wild animals. It's much lower, the wild meat, in saturated fat, higher in omega-3s. It's free of antibiotics and added hormones, and in Paleolithic times it was also free of environmental contaminants. And wild plants don't equal domestic plants. Cultivated fruits and vegetables and so forth have been bred for appearance, palatability, transportability, digestibility, and yield. Wild plants deliver 3 times the fiber of commercial plants. So you have to eat a lot of plants to try to mimic a Paleolithic diet. They're also more concentrated in nutrients as well and lower in sugar. What about the reduced disease risk? Well, we have a lot of small short-term trials suggesting pretty impressive results in terms of body weight, satiety, lipid profiles, glucose, insulin sensitivity, inflammation, blood pressure, all of those things. Why the favorable results? Well, because we're limiting fast foods, fried foods, processed meat, refined grains, refined sugars, concentrated fats and oils, high-fat dairy products, and alcohol in the clinical trials. People who are doing real paleo munch away on pepperoni sticks, so it may not be quite the same as a clinical trial. But my concern is, are we looking at short-term gain for long-term pain? While paleo diets may induce weight loss and favorable short-term lab results, there are really big concerns about adopting this kind of diet long-term because they're high meat diets. And this means a lot of animal protein, agrochemicals, a lot of TMAO production, endotoxins, environmental contaminants like dioxins and heavy metals, heme iron, new 5-GC, nitrosamines, products of high temperature cookings, especially heterocyclic amines, saturated fat, cholesterol, and we get an upregulation of cancer-promoting genes with meat as well. We just had a new study published from the Journal of Nutrition that came from Australia showing that the paleo, people on a paleo diet compared to a conventional, traditional Australian diet had lower levels of healthful bacteria in their colons, had higher levels of TMAO producing bacteria and double the blood levels of TMAO. They had lower levels of short-chain fatty acids. Whoops, paleo diet, and the conclusion was that these patterns are harmful to health because they eliminate our most concentrated sources of fiber and prebiotics, legumes and whole grains. They increase saturated fat and other atherogenic compounds. How much meat are they actually eating? Well, in a 2,000 calorie diet, it's about 150 grams, and in a 2,800 calorie diet, about 210 grams of protein. And so it's 16 to 22 ounces of meat per day. It's unbelievable. How much meat is actually safe to eat? Well, Walter Willett was asked this question several years ago, and he answered the following. If you step back and look at the data, the optimum amount of red meat you should eat would be 0. And so let's compare plant-based versus low-carb. We have clear, consistent evidence that whole plant foods are protective to health, that heavily processed foods, fast foods, and fried foods with added fat, sugar, and salt are damaging to health, and meat, especially processed meat and red meat, increase risk of disease. And national and international guidelines reflect this knowledge. Number 1 in the 12 steps to healthy eating from the World Health Organization is to eat a nutritious diet based on a variety of foods originating mainly from plants rather than animals. In the FAO Plates, Pyramids, and Planets, they highlight international leaders that promote largely plant-based diets. Germany, Brazil, Qatar, the UK. And of course, you're aware of the report from the Lancet Commission, EAT, from 2019. They describe a universal healthy reference diet as one that increases healthy foods like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, and nuts, and decreases unhealthy foods like red meat, sugar, and refined grains. Then even in the dietary guidelines for Americans, we're talking about a diet higher in plant-based foods, lower in animal-based foods, is more health-promoting than what people are eating. And Canada's Food Guide, being a Canadian myself, I want to show this off. It is, We've gone plant-based. Look at this plate. It's half fruits and vegetables, a quarter grains, and a quarter protein-rich foods, but at least half of which are plant-based. And dairy's relegated to a very small section of this guide, which which we, of course, were celebrating when it came out. And the acid test is really the blue zones. So we're looking at, when you look at the blue zones, every single blue zone is plant-based. There is not one blue zone that is paleo or keto, not one. And if you look at the average intakes, you're looking at 62% of calories from carbohydrates, 25% from fat, and 12% from protein. Now let's wind up with the good, the bad, and the ugly. So here we have it. The good is keto and paleo diets eliminate refined carbohydrates, the starches like white flour products and sugars like soda. They eliminate a lot of highly processed foods. The bad, they're high in fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. They're high in pro-oxidants and chemical contaminants. They're low in fiber, phytochemicals, and antioxidants. And they have a lot of potential nutrition shortfalls, especially the keto, in terms of both minerals and vitamins. But the ugly is low-carb diets are high animal food diets. They are both ecologically unsustainable and ethically unjustifiable. Low-carb diets downplay the ecological crisis that makes eating lower on the food chain an ecological imperative. If our entire population ate a low-carb diet, our planet's dwindling resources would very quickly run dry. David Katz did the math on this, and he said if we all ate paleo, we would need 15 planet Earths to sustain our current population. Imagine what we would need by 2050. There was a report in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2016 that suggested that greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced by 29% if we all followed the global dietary guidelines to eat more fruits and vegetables, eat less meat, sugar, and calories. But they would be reduced by 70% if we all ate a vegan diet. And their recommendation was a global shift to a plant-based diet. And we will never, ever have a diet that's optimal for human beings if it is not ethically justifiable. For people, if everyone ate plant-based, the global calorie supply would increase by an estimated 50%, which could effectively wipe out hunger. And for animals, to me, it makes no sense to cause pain, suffering, and death in other living beings when it is absolutely unnecessary. Not only is it unnecessary, we're harming ourselves in the process. We slaughter 70 billion land animals for food every year, about 90% of which are raised in CAFOs. Imagine what that number would do if everyone ate paleo. We could triple it. The ultimate question is this: how can humans best adapt to their current environment to sustain a growing population on a shrinking planet? By getting our nutrition from plants, we all win. We have a choice. When we consider the consequences of our food choices, not just for ourselves, but beyond ourselves, a plant-based diet becomes both an ecological and an ethical imperative. And I would like to end with this cartoon. The keys to a long life are avoid fatty meats, get your daily exercise, and eat your veggies. Thank you.